user-centered robot design. I am Dharani, co-organizer of Women in Robotics Boston, along with my friend Sanjuksha, and we have Gina volunteering to help tonight with the event. A little about us. Women in Robotics is a nonprofit organization founded by Andra Kay at Silicon Valley Robotics in California. And this is the Boston chapter of Women in Robotics. We are a professional network for women who are working or aspire to work in robotics. Anyone from any professional background who supports our cause is welcome to join the group, and sign up link is shared in the chat. We also want to thank our Zoom sponsors, Vecna Robotics, for their constant support. Well, that being said, this topic of user-centered design is very relevant these days as more and more robots are being deployed in different applications and finding themselves operating in human-dense environments. And effective human-robot interaction becomes essential, and research suggests that robot design plays an important role to achieve that. So today we have with us Ms. Lauren Stern and Ms. Shipra Arora from iRobot to tell us more about this research and key takeaways to keep in mind during robot development. And I'm honored and glad to introduce them. First, we have Ms. Lauren Stern, who is a design researcher at iRobot, where she focuses on research efforts related to robot behavior and interaction specific to the home environment. Prior to her time at iRobot, Lauren's user experience work focused on the research and design of collaborative analysis tools for government and business agencies. When not conducting research, she enjoys reading, dancing, and board games. Thank you for joining us, Lauren.
Very excited to be here.
Next is Ms. Shipra Arora. She's a user experience designer at iRobot, where she focuses her design efforts on new product innovation and robot behaviors. Shipra joined iRobot in 2018 after graduating in human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon. Prior to her design life, Shipra was a developer and has a hybrid skill set in UX design, research, and software development. That's really interesting. She enjoys working at the intersection of all three disciplines, supporting how people make sense of and interact with their world. And I think that's really cool. Thank you for joining us, Shipra.
Thank you for having us.
I
enjoy board games too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, to our attendees, welcome everyone. And we expect to have good participation tonight. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, check out our poll, and use the Q&A section to ask any questions you may have. All right, I think we can get started. Over to you both.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm going to take a second here to set the screen up. Cool. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining in. Lauren and I are super excited to talk to you about user-centered robot design. So let's get started. So at iRobot, our goal is to build thoughtful robots that empower people to do more. And we make a lot of different types of robots based on different user needs. We make products that are focused on floor care, as well as ones that are educational robots that empower kids and people of all ages to learn how to code. And for a robot to be helpful, it really needs to be grounded in a user need, which means it needs to be usable, useful, and universal. And Lauren is going to talk to us about what that means.
Yeah, so at iRobot, we have this thing we call the Builder's Code, which is our sort of principles that we operate on as an organization. And our big one is to put consumers first. And so it's really important to us that we're thinking about humans in the center of how we're designing robots. And as Shipra said, we use these terms useful, usable, and universal. And we thought it would help to introduce all three as we're getting started here. So we need all of these. They all work together to create a product that's really helpful. So when we say that a robot is useful, we mean that we're alleviating a real problem. We're solving something and creating a solution for it. There's a need for this. When we say that something is usable or a robot is usable, we mean that not only is it solving a problem, but you can actually interact with it, you can get it to do the job that you want it to do. It's easy to learn. You can remember how to use it. You don't have to look on YouTube every time you pull it out of the closet, and it really can fall into your day-to-day life. And universal means that it's available to people of all abilities and skill levels. So this isn't something that's reserved just for people who are really good with technology and can program themselves. This is something that everybody can use, everybody can learn and pick up. So all three of these principles are really important to us. And all three of them come into our practice. So as you heard, we are part of the iRobot design team, and that means that we're putting consumers first all the time. Thinking about humans is really critical to what we do. And today we're going to talk about some ways that we do that and share some lessons that we've learned. So the first lesson, or the first thing that I wanted to say about that is that for each of these lessons, we have a process that we go through. And for those of you who already work in the field or in user experience, you might be familiar with the concept that design isn't a linear process. There's lots of iteration, going back, rethinking things that happens. But there's really three sort of phases that we cover at every piece, every iteration that we're going through. We want to explore, we want to understand the humans that we're trying to help. We have to identify those needs and pain points, as well as understanding the environment around them and their context. And we want to define the solution that we're going to try to build. We have to figure out what it is that we want to do. And then as we build and after we build, we have to assess it. We need to evaluate if what we're doing makes sense. Is it meeting those three principles that I talked about? Is it useful? Is it usable? Is it universal? And that's when we might go back and start at the beginning and continue to iterate until we come up with something that meets all of those needs. All right, so the first principle that we're going to dive into today, and I'll just note, we're going to go through three of these. If you have questions, please post them in Q&A, and we'll try to pause in each principle and get to your questions there, as well as at the end. So the first principle is to explore the environment where your robot will live and work. And this is because when we talk about robots in particular, when we talk about autonomy or tech products, we are not talking about something that exists in a vacuum. We're talking about something that's going to live somewhere, whether it's your office, your kitchen, a disaster zone somewhere. This robot has to exist in a space, and that space may inform or should inform your design decisions, as well as where the user is. That might be the same space, it might be a different space, but how does that environment, how does that context in which this human is interacting with the robot, whether person to robot or whether they're remote, far away from the robot, that kind of context is going to impact what their experience is like, and we want to make sure that we're designing for it. So to break this down a little bit further, when we talk about the environment, that context, we're going to start really broad. The first thing we want to think about is, where is this robot going to be? Is it in an office? Is it in the mall? Is it in your home? So is it inside? Is it outside? All of those things are going to go into the design of the robot, the look and feel of it, the shape, the terrain that it needs to be able to handle, whether that's floors or whether that's grass, hills that it needs to be able to get over. All of that needs to come into play. Is it going to be a slippery environment? Maybe that changes the wheels that you want to use if it's going to have wheels. So we want to think really broad and then narrow from there. For the purpose of today, we're going to be using ourselves as examples, and at iRobot, we're designing for home environments most of the time. And so one of the things that's really important to us to do is to visit homes. You can learn a lot about humans and about culture and about people from seeing what their homes are like, from understanding that context where the robot is going to be used. So we try to go and do that whenever possible. Obviously, how we go and do that has changed a lot in the last couple of years, but we are always looking for ways to really dive deep with folks, understand their environment. And part of that also means thinking worldwide. When we're working on a robot that's going to be used in many different homes across the world, you can't just think about the home next door. You have to think about what that's like globally, because homes differ, those environments will differ. So when we talk about terrain, for example, what floors look like in Paris are very different than what floors look like in Tokyo or in Dallas, Texas. And so we want to be thinking about all of those environments that the robot needs to be able to interact with. And I'll give you an example of how we put this into practice. The photos that you just saw are from research that we did before we launched the Roomba i3. And the Roomba i3 built on what we had done previously and built on this work. to coexist. That was really our goal. We wanted the robot to be able to coexist in this space. So we moved from the glossy black plastic and multiple UI elements that you see on the Roomba i7 to a gray robot with a faux fabric ring and a cleaner, more streamlined user interface. And I can't get into the specifics of the research and exactly what led to this design, but given that I just said this is an object that needs to coexist in a variety of different homes across the world, you can likely infer some of the rationale that led to these changes in the color, material, and finish. And as we go through this presentation, we also wanted to show a little bit of the impact that we have with these designs, because it's not enough to just say, okay, we're going to try to make something human focused. We're going to design for users. The goal is to have impact, to really make a difference in people's lives. And so this is an example of how we were able to do that. And we'll continue to call back to some of these examples as we go through today. And I'm going to pass it over to Shipra, who's going to dive a little deeper into what these home environments are like.
So Lauren mentioned that when we think about user-centered design, the context of use and the space that the robot needs to handle is important. And when we start thinking about user homes, which is what we tackle, it's not just the floor type or the grass, there's other objects in your home, things like furniture, inhabitants in your home that the robot will encounter that we need to start thinking about. And the nature of the home is that it's always changing. It's transient and it's not always robot friendly or robot ready. And a few of these pictures are my home of my own home of what it could look like at a given time during a day or the week. So the question we started asking ourselves really was, how do you design for changing home environments and different members of the home, be it pets, humans, whatever you can think of. And in addition to understanding what's in the environment or the home, we also wanted to understand how users think about their space and the nuances that go along with that. For example, a human might want to avoid a certain place or clean a certain place a little extra, and they would want the robot to do the same, just the way that they clean. And we want to respect the user's choices and clean the way they would. And over the years, we've observed a bunch of workarounds that users set up to create the desired experience that they're really looking for. So if you look at the image on the left here, one of the users we met, they put these little socks on their chairs, and it was to prevent the robot from bumping into the chairs and ruining the furniture. And we've created accessories to do the job and help you out. So on the image on the right here, you can see behind the pet poles, there's a tiny gray tower, and what we call it is a virtual wall. And it's a small tower that emits a beam. It could be like a fan or straight ahead, and it kind of tells the robot to not come in this area. So that's a workaround of protecting a space that you want to protect. But these didn't really meet the needs of the users at the time. Some of the reasons being, you can start thinking of it, if you have multiple spaces in your home, it's not really practical to put 10 of these as an example in your home. And it's pretty easy to move these around, so that's not ideal either. So the takeaway here would be to start observing not only what people say, but how they've created workarounds for the problems they might be facing in their home, how they're achieving the solutions that they want. So when we started thinking about this problem space, we designed another solution, and this time we went digital, and we call it keep out zones and clean zones. And the keep out zones and clean zones actually enable users to leverage the robot's mapping technology to customize where the robot can clean a little extra or avoid. And you can add as many of these as you want on your map. It could be any size that you want. And this way, it's easier for users to control how they want to clean their home without having to set up these hacks that they were previously doing. And as Lauren mentioned, we wanted to share the impact. So creating a solution driven by user needs greatly impacted the user experience. And this was really reflected in the reviews that we saw. And I'll give you a second to read through them. Cool. And even as keep out zones and clean zones provide a usable, useful, and universal solution for users, we wanted to explore ways to make the experience even better. What else could we do? So we started designing for the robot to be more thoughtful in the home. So as it's moving, it would clean the way you would. So you could control the robot, but it would be less work at your end to do in terms of setting up zones or putting physical barriers. And that's where we come to J7. So we actually launched the Roomba J7 last week. And since our launch of our product, it's been amazing to see the reception to the new capability and thoughtfulness. And to give you a brief intro, this robot actually detects objects in the home. And these objects might be some that are permanent, semi-permanent, transient. So it could be furniture, pet waste, cords that are lying around, and the robot recognizes them and avoids them. And it actually lets you decide what spaces you want to clean how. So this way, we're being more thoughtful with how we're cleaning rather than having to set up hacks or solutions for it.
All right, so to take us back to our principle, what we want to leave you with from this section is that when we design for people, when we design for users, that really means we're designing for the context in which they're going to be interacting with and using the robot. So thinking about where the robot will be stored, where it's going to do whatever the task is that it's built to do, where the human is going to be while they're controlling the robot, whether it's standing right next to the robot or 1,000 miles away. Who is going to be using the robot? Who else might be around them that will be impacted by this? Thinking about their existing ecosystems and the world in which they live and operate. All of that really comes into play when we talk about robots and when we talk about designing for people. And so as a researcher, I want to encourage all of you to get out there and emphasize that when we talk about understanding context, you don't actually need a robot to do any of this work. Yes, if you have one, great, cool. It's fun to see how people are using a product that already exists, but really a lot of the work that we do in this kind of a phase is more about people. It's about their environments. It's about what their needs are and what their aesthetic preferences are, what their homes are like. And so we are doing a lot of this work before we ever have a robot that we've built to put in front of folks. So you don't need to have something done. You don't even need to have a prototype to go out and learn about people. And that's really, really valuable for the process.
Cool. Thanks, Lauren. So I'm going to kick us off with the second principle here, and we'll be talking about designing interactions that best match user needs. And what I mean by that is, when you think about people interacting with a device, they might be controlling it remotely, like you might be at work trying to start your robot, you might be in the kitchen doing some other task, or you might be next to the robot actually pressing the button. And so we want to design for the ways that users can naturally interact with the product. And when we think about interacting with a robot, the first thing that comes to mind is the physical button that's on the robot. And when we're thinking of evolving our interactions, we wanted to start with the most basic interaction, which to us is the button. So we spent time diving into the usability of our robot buttons. As you can see on the left here, our i7 is the structure that we had for our buttons. It was a 3-button design. And we really worked on simplifying our robot experience to a single button with the J7, where the button was really focused on doing what you want in the moment. So this is sort of my condensed version of what the robot's interactions are with the button. And so now the robot's really simplified to start and stop from that single button, and it adapts given the context. So Lauren and I spent a lot of time researching what was intuitive to users when they think about controlling a robot. And we used the learnings from that to really inform the design here. And a lot of it was adapting with familiarity that you have with controlling other devices in your home as devices are evolving. So simple tap interactions here can lead you to start, stop, pause, all the primary actions that you can think of. Depending on the context of the robot and what it was doing, a single tap would lead you to what you're looking for. And for more complex interactions or secondary actions, we started using some familiar interactions around holds that you've used on other devices. Like a short hold might lead to X interaction and a longer hold might lead to another interaction. So I'd really encourage everyone to explore examples of standard interactions that are out there in the world and to then condense and simplify it to the most pure interaction that you could have with that device, because the more simple it is, the more intuitive it is.
One of the things we also found was that there are some interactions that we may think of as being really basic, for example, pausing the robot. And so we went into this with, yep, need a button, got to pause the robot. But then when we actually talk to people, it turns out that chasing a robot across your living room to try and press the button to pause it is harder than pulling out your cell phone and doing it on the app. So when Shipra talks about that purity, like part of it is also just like what's going to make sense, even if it seems really basic.
Thanks, Lauren. And in addition to button, Lauren mentioned we looked at app, but we also looked at voice. And as humans, we all tend to gravitate towards more natural interactions like conversation, and voice is one that really comes easily to us. And it especially comes in handy when you're multitasking or your hands are busy doing something else and you don't want to go over and press the button or pull out the phone to check the app. So we wanted to leverage interactions that people have on a day-to-day basis and use their existing routines and make it as simple as saying, Alexa, go tell my robot to clean around the dining table because the kids made a mess, or hey Google, can you tell my robot to clean the mudroom? So the purest and easiest interaction is what we focused on again. And when we're thinking of different ways people clean their home and really being there for them in that home moment and being thoughtful, we also learned in research that users typically vacuum first. So they want to pick up the dry stuff off the floor and then they go into wet mop. So you don't really want to essentially go in with a wet mop and get into the dry debris. So we wanted to support that routine and the way that people really clean in their home. So we designed a way for robots to clean in tandem, where the vacuum goes out first and you can configure it so that the mop will follow it after. So that way you can configure the devices that you want to clean just the way you would. And Lauren's gonna share the impact again and sum it up for us.
Yeah, so as Shipra mentioned, we do research throughout the design process. This isn't something where we're coming in at the end and just doing a test to make sure that we're good to go. This is really an integrated collaborative process. But it is nice to be able to look at reviews and other press coverage and see that people are really picking up on the changes that we're making. So with interaction, this really, when we think about making pure interactions, making interactions that feel natural to humans, this is what takes some of these comments from this is a device that is useful to this is a good collaborator. This is what makes this product the thing that I reach for. It's distinguishing itself from the pack. So it's really, again, about that experience and thinking about what makes sense to us as people. So wrapping us up here with our second principle, as Shipra has really emphasized, it's important to let the human's behavior, what we already naturally do, drive interaction. And as a designer or as a researcher, observing people in different contexts, trying different devices. Again, you don't have to have your product already built or have your robot ready to go to start to explore some of these things. We do a lot of research before we get to that point, using other devices or using just things that we've made out of cardboard. We're really into robot puppets. So you can really start to explore and to play here. And we would recommend looking for behavior in the wild. So familiar patterns, what is going to resonate with folks that they're already doing? What are ways that humans communicate, that humans give instructions that you can leverage to make your product feel intuitive and feel natural for the given moment? And also, as Shipra talked about with the button, this is constantly something we're redefining and reflecting on. What is familiar in our culture, what a familiar interaction is in terms of technology changes as our references change. So as new technology is becoming more common in the home or in other environments, what people are used to in that setting or to do a specific task is also going to evolve. And that means that what they expect or what's familiar to them is changing. So it's helpful for us to continue to go back, revisit what we've already done and decide if that still makes sense moving forward or if you want to change it and maybe see if you can make it better. Right. I'm going to wrap us up with our third principle here. So we've talked a little bit about this idea of centering the user in how we design robots, thinking about human behavior, human contexts, but there's a lot more to being human than just where we are and kind of what we do. There's also all the things that we feel and that we perceive. And so when we talk about robots and talk about human-robot interaction, it's really important to think about that in your design. So we're going to talk a little bit about emotional experience. And to start off, robots may not have emotions, but we do. And so when we think about what that interaction is going to be like, yes, there's kind of cut and dry what the robot is going to do based on different stimuli or what's happening in a given moment, but there's also what the human is experiencing, and that's really what we should be designing for.
And how we capture emotions is through behaviors, is what we call them. Ambient cues like light give the way for the user to understand what the robot is thinking and doing. And it's the way, honestly, the robot communicates with the user. So highlighting certain things like moments of celebration and intervention really let the user know what's happening and leverage an emotional response. So in this case, what you're seeing on the screen right here, on the left, we have what we call dirt detect, and on the right is an image of the robot actually seeing dirt. So it's a behavior that happens if the robot is moving and it finds a certain area that's more concentrated with dirt. So what it does is it does a special movement back and forth, and the light does this little blue flash dance. It's really nice to kind of celebrate that moment that I found this extra space that had a little dirt, and also conveys that I'm doing a certain special action, which is why I'm moving back and forth, versus if I was cleaning otherwise, I'd be doing a different behavior. And if you were to miss it, you still have a clean floor, but it's really nice to capture that emotion and celebrate it. And sound coupled with light can be a strong combination, honestly, to provide feedback to the user when they're interacting with the robot. So we have a lot of interactions where if the robot is starting, going back, when it's done cleaning, we really use sound and light together to kind of show you what's happened or celebrate a moment. And it really reinforces what's happening in that moment. So the example we have right here is the J7 that came out last week. And I'll show you what it is. But if you want to send the robot home, let's say it was cleaning, you had guests come over and you're like, honestly, I just want you to go back and we'll clean once everything is done. What you have to do is hold down the button for 2 to 5 seconds. And what it'll do is count down the seconds as the light moves. And once it's at the top, which is 4 seconds as an example, it does this little pop sound and the light falls back. So that way it reinforces that you've given the command and I know what you're telling me to do. So I'll play the videos here real quick. And the other one. So these are just ways that we try to convey what we're doing, also reinforce that we're listening and we're doing what you asked us to do. And Lauren's going to talk us more through this.
Yeah, so the videos that Shipra just showed are examples of how the robot works, but also examples of some of the stimuli that we might use when those animations exist, when those sound files exist, to try and understand this. So part of our process as human-centered designers and researchers is thinking about the emotional experience that we want to create, those moments of celebration, those moments of reassurance to the user. And then we want to make sure that we're actually having the intended emotional impact. And so we want to look at the impact of our design in terms of a human's emotional experience and their perception of the robot. And that's a little bit different than the other types of research that we've mentioned tonight. So we've talked a lot about observation and maybe trying out what's usable or different kinds of interactions using either your device or maybe a different analogous device. But when we talk about emotion and perception, we're really trying to get at what's going on inside. And so we can't use the same methods that we would use when we're talking about external behaviors or looking at an environmental context. So when we measure the impact of design in terms of perception and emotional experience, we have to standardize it, or we have decided to standardize it. And this type of research comes out of best practices from psychology work, specifically looking at things like personality and understanding human perceptions of ourselves and each other. And it's also been used in robotics work, in laboratories and academic settings worldwide. So there's a lot of background to validate this kind of work and kind of point us in this direction. So there's a few different elements that helped us get to this point at iRobot. The first step is that we need a baseline understanding of how our product or prototype is currently viewed. So we need something to compare against to see if we've made a change. When you're measuring impact, that's kind of the baseline. That's what we call it. Like you need that, or you don't know if what you've done is a change or not. So we need baseline data. The second piece of this is that we need a framework. So we need to know what we care about. What are the elements of the experience that really matter to us as an organization, as a business, as designers? Like what do we want to measure? What impact are we looking for? Do we want to see if we're having? And then we also need a tool. So we need a way to actually collect that data, to collect baseline data, and then compare new data to that baseline in order to evaluate the change. So at iRobot, we've gone through a process to come up with our own metric system based on some of the work that's out there in the world. so that we can do this kind of study. So here's an example of what the final product of this looks like. It's a chart, it's not that exciting, but this really is hugely important for us when we're working on some of those really small, nuanced emotional experiences that Shipra was talking about designing. So in this case, our scale that we developed is called the iRobot Index, because we use it at iRobot, and we were looking at a behavior change. And in this particular case, the change was coming for a technical reason. We were trying to help the robot perform better in the home, and we wanted to ensure that we were not having a negative emotional impact. So just like sometimes we might design specific emotional experiences, we also want to know if we're having unintended impacts. So we were looking at what, if any, difference was being caused by this new behavior. So we had users who had prototype versions of the robot, and we were able to have them experience both behaviors over time and then rate each of them as they were experiencing it. And then we could look for a difference. And in this case, there wasn't a difference, but that was okay. Like sometimes that's a good thing. We were looking to see if there would be an impact because we wanted to make sure that we weren't having an unintended impact. And so we found that there was no difference. And if you're interested in that kind of work or in trying this out yourself, I'll mention that the Godspeed questionnaire is a really common framework that's used in robotics research. And I would recommend that one if you're curious in checking more of this out. But to wrap up our principle here, we want to include those squishy experiences, the emotion and perception, in how we think about design and in how we evaluate our designs. So the first thing that I would recommend, I just mentioned the Godspeed questionnaire, standardize your practice, find tools and validate them to make sure that they're a good fit for the work that you're doing, build a baseline, or if you're working with a common population, you might even be able to find research papers online, like through Google Scholar, that will give you some data that you can use as a baseline. And make this sort of evaluation part of your design process. This doesn't work if you only look at the emotion occasionally. You have to be thinking about and really treating emotion as central to the experience all the time. So when we talk about keeping the human centered in our work, part of that is thinking about human experience, frustration, joy, surprise, all of that stuff. It's really, it's what sets robots apart, is that they can be really fun and they can also be really confusing. All right. So hopefully this has been an inspiring half an hour of presentation. We look forward to hearing any questions that you have. To wrap us up here, these are the 3 principles again: context matters, intentional interactions, and consider emotions.
Want to walk through them more? Or?
Oh, I was going to let you do it.
Okay, cool. Well, just to start with the first one. So context matters. Consider the environment that you're designing for, the terrain, like Lauren mentioned, the things that might be in your space, stationary, mobile, and honestly, just go out and learn. And you can learn a lot from observing and talking to people. So leverage that as much as possible. Second one here is intentional interaction. So ones that fit seamlessly into someone's life. So I'd encourage for you to look at behaviors that are familiar with people out in the wild, ones that are standard, and simplify and condense them to the simplest experience that applies to your device. And sometimes that means adapting familiar interactions, to be honest. And iterate, iterate, iterate. So put solutions out in front of people. They're going to evolve over time as technology changes, as people get more familiar with technology, but also you're probably going to find a better way to work towards the same problem that you were looking at. So keep iterating and don't be afraid to reflect and redefine. Lauren's going to talk us through the emotional part here.
Yeah, so we've talked about standardization using metrics. The other thing that I'll say is that feelings are valid. When we think about data and we think about research, it's very easy to get really focused on metrics that are clear cut, like how long it took to do something, or if someone succeeded or failed at a task. But sometimes how people perceive the experience doesn't align with that kind of data, doesn't align with how we're interpreting something, but that doesn't actually make it any less valid. That experience that someone has shapes their understanding of the product, shapes their understanding of what's going on. And so even if it doesn't match what we think is happening, it'll change how they use the robot in the future. It'll change if they use the robot in the future. So because we know that that can have such an impact, it's really critical to keep it central to our design process. So go forth and design. We look forward to seeing your creations at a meetup someday in the future. And in the meantime, come find us. We'll be at UXPA Boston and Grace Hopper Celebration later this month and later this fall. The links for both of those conferences are in the chat, as well as a link to the iRobot Careers website. We do have positions open. We also have a really amazing co-op and internship program. So if you're early in your career and you're interested in that, we're happy to answer questions and also definitely check it out.
We also have a great STEM program, just to add a plug in there. So if you are curious about what we do a bunch of things like job shadows, talk about our career paths, failures that we faced, and how we've gotten to where we are. You could check out our educational robots. There's all sorts of things. So you can leverage our STEM program as well. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
So much. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I actually want to get started with the Q&A. I have a question myself. First of all, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear the presentation this way, and it really helped. I was hooked till the end, the design and then the impact. That's just really helpful. So one question I have is, it might seem a little silly, but how do you store the data? You mentioned that, well, the example of the button. As an engineer, I want to understand, like, how does this impact, I mean, the design team might say that we want to place it a certain way, or we want a certain amount of button per se, but in the actual manufacturing side, it might not be possible. So in the end, like, who wins, and how do you, and secondly, how do you store that data? Is it like in the app, or you directly transfer it over on the server or something like that?
That's a great question. So it's multifaceted. There's sort of, okay, so I'll break it down and say there's kind of two types of data that we talk about. There's research data, and then there's robot data. Robot data might be a kind of research data, but when we talk about user research data, we're talking about videos, written feedback, survey responses, things that are coming from a person who is submitting feedback to us. And that might be a live interview that we're recording, whether it's on Zoom or in person, so that we have that record. We usually will do auto transcription so that it helps with notes. All of the notes that we take are then data. We have surveys, and then sometimes we'll also have robot data, meaning we can see if you're using a prototype robot, we can have access to some of the data, like when you ran it, how long it ran, if it encountered an error, and that can be really helpful in even just tracking, are you doing the thing that we asked you to do or not? If I asked you to run the robot this week, did you? So it's not that we're getting invasive or anything, it's just kind of to help us make sure that everything's going as expected during the course of whatever the study is. Then there's robot data, separate from research, where we're looking at overall activity, how many robots exist in the world and are being used connected to the internet. And we don't have, iRobot has a very strong stance on privacy, so we don't have access to any of that data. It's very locked down. We have a whole privacy team that kind of manages that. But when we're in the prototyping space, before something is launched and out in the world for you to buy, that's when we would be looking at things like, are people pressing the button, or how often are they initiating a job to a specific room versus to their whole floor? So we do, the engineering team in particular will monitor those sorts of stats, and there's usually a dashboard that goes along with the project where they'll be able to kind of keep an eye on things and share anything that they're seeing. So there's usually a person or two on the team who's in charge of kind of monitoring that data. But we have to think about that in advance. So the robot doesn't automatically just share all this data. Like, we have to specifically set up in those cases, it has to be programmed in what things we want to know about. So if we want to track, say, a button press, we have to know that up front. So the prototype will send that information back to us.
Lauren, did you mention our data science team?
I did not, and I should.
So we have a great data science team that's really helping us not only look at the data and give us insights, but notice patterns, notice things are happening, and we generate insights from those as well. So we have data from UX research, as Lauren mentioned. We have robot data, we have app data, and then we have these people helping us make sense of the data that's coming in. And surprisingly, all of it is also in Lauren's head. So if you ever have a question about any research, Lauren will have the answer because she remembers everything that has ever happened. So it's beautiful. To the other part of your question, your question was about who wins when there's things that you might want to do and it might not be practical. I don't really think it's about winning or who gets the final say. So it's an entire collaboration where we figure out what the user need is, how we can solve it. We might have a vision of how we want to solve it, but then you have to go back and work with the engineers, see what's practical, not only practical, see how you can best achieve that vision. And then you iterate as you go. It's not to say that I might think of something and that's exactly how it's going to be. You might learn things about your own design or your vision as you're working on it. So it's a constant iteration as we go.
That's a great point. And sometimes we can have a design that we think is amazing and it might even test really well. And then there's an external factor that changes how we need to approach the problem, like a pandemic and global supply chain shortages. So it's helpful to be flexible. And like Shipra said, I love what you said about nobody winning. I mentioned we have this builder's code, this kind of philosophy at iRobot, and one of the aspects of it is put consumers first. Two of the other aspects of it are debate and commit and have each other's backs. And both of those really come into play when we're collaborating because everyone is very passionate, has ideas. And so we want to make sure that we're talking through them, really thinking about the data and then making the best possible decision that everyone's aligned on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It gives me a good insight in the infrastructure and a good point on the values as well of how to design. I guess we have more questions.
We have
Sanjay,
one
you
about
wanted to...
I was just going to talk through it. I noticed one that was about different. So it says, you mentioned making stuff usable for people of all abilities. Do you have specific standards, checklists, guidelines, or principles you use to make sure designs end up being accessible?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will say that this is always a work in progress. It's definitely something that we're thinking about and that we're constantly working on. We're actually in the process of evaluating some of our experiences and looking for ways to make them more accessible. We conduct research with people with different abilities and disabilities to kind of make sure that we're about not just looking for solutions that are accessible, but also talking to the people who are actually going to use the product. Like what things do they already use that are natural interactions for them? So like we were talking about that before, looking for human behavior and like letting that inspire the design. That also applies when we're talking about accessibility. So I definitely wouldn't say we're perfect at it, but we're definitely paying attention to it and trying to improve all the time. We use the same WCAG standards of accessibility for some of our design guidelines, and then the team also has some more specific ones.
Yeah. A quick example is something we shared today. So for someone who might have a visual impairment, depending on just light, to be able to see what the robot is doing or understand what's happening when you're interacting with it might not be the best idea. So that's when the sound comes in. That's how that's helpful for someone who might be looking for a different type of feedback. So that's a quick example.
All right, I'll read this one. I'm also curious how easy it was to integrate with Alexa / Google Voice / other external systems. Are there easy to use APIs that make that simple, or was it a big process?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm gonna answer really well, but they're all big companies. So a lot of it is all the business side of how to collaborate with them. And that takes a whole set of people and a whole set of team to figure out how to collaborate with these companies. But outside of that, I have personally worked on Alexa and creating skills for Alexa, and I would say it's pretty easy. And the same for Google Home. What we have to do is understand how people are trying to interact with voice, because that's very different than how you would with an app or the button on the robot. So for us, it's how can you create the same experience that people would with our other modes of interaction, but how can it be more natural to voice? So that's kind of the key, to work with the developers and to work with the people that are on here to make the interactions match what it would be, what would be ideal for voice. But overall, working with Alexa and Google is easy. There's a whole business side that I don't know much about.
Yeah, we have a team that works on partnerships and stuff. So that's not on us to do. When we do research on that, a lot of the time we don't have something built. Like it's getting the robot to talk to the app, to talk to the voice assistant is enough of a process that we can't just really quick do something every time we want to test a new idea. And sometimes we don't know what it is we want to build. Like Shipra was saying, we want to figure out what's the most natural interaction. So we use a technique called Wizard of Ozzing a lot. If for those of you who may not be familiar with it, in the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz, there's a wizard who's kind of the man behind the curtain who has this like fake display so that people think he's this like great smoke face, but actually he's like a little guy in the back. And so that's where the term comes from. When we talk about it in a user research way, what we mean is that we are faking an experience. We are creating smoke and mirrors to set up an experience for the user. So one example of doing that is voice, where we may not have a whole skill built for Alexa, but we want to test this idea and figure out how people want to talk to the voice assistant to give this kind of a command. So we have a user research lab that looks like a home at iRobot. It has couches, and table, and a kitchen and stuff. So we do when we're in person, we do research there sometimes. And so we brought folks in one at a time for sessions, and we had set up some example responses that a voice assistant could make that we had just recorded ourselves. And they were little MP3 files that we had on a phone. And then we had a speaker. And so folks could talk to the speaker, and then there was someone sitting in the corner on the couch taking notes. And depending on what the person said, they would play the right file so that it felt to the participant like the voice assistant was responding to them. And then the same person was also running the robot. They had the app set up, and so they would give the command through the app. So it felt to the people that were in the study like they were giving a voice command and the robot was responding and the voice assistant was responding appropriately, but actually all being run from the back corner. And so that let us get feedback on an experience before we'd actually built it.
And to just add more color to the development side of this, these companies are working with all sorts of apps, so they're pretty familiar with how to create a structure where you can just pull things from their website, anything that you want in terms of logos, code, and you can seamlessly integrate it within your application. If you want to start getting fancy, that's like customizing things to match your app, or kind of if you're trying to log in, try to stay within your app when you're logging in, that's when it gets complicated. But if you try to do the minimum or try to do it at a level where it's not specific, really customized to what you want, I would say it's still easy to integrate. Cool. Any other questions?
I do have one quick question, actually.
Yeah.
So you said that example about the user preferring to operate it via the phone instead of like pressing the button on the robot, and like it's really hard to like follow the robot and find the button and press it. So I find it really interesting. Like sometimes the feedback changes the whole design process. Like, okay, this is something the user would want. So you have any more examples like that, or any particular thing that kind of changed your perspective on it?
Yes. Let me think. I would say that it happens pretty frequently that something changed, like that we talk to people and it changes my perspective on stuff, honestly. So I was working at iRobot when I got married, and I definitely structured my wedding registry around products that had come up in research that people had talked about, like, oh, I love this particular mop, or like, this is my favorite vacuum. I definitely did some shopping that way. But more on topic, better example.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I think one thing that was really interesting for me was when we were working on J7, which is the robot that we just launched. It's really fun. We can talk about it now. We've been working on it for a really long time. We're exploring how we could allow users to give feedback to the robot about what it was seeing. And when we were working on it, we were really thinking about that, or I was really thinking about that from this perspective of like, you're going to be able to help the robot. It's going to make mistakes potentially sometimes, or like it's not going to have machine learning to learn every single obstacle in your house, and you're going to be able to give it feedback, and like it's really magical. And when we talk to users, that was true. Like there was value there, and we worked on refining that interface. But also there were so many people who just expressed this like almost gratefulness that they could see what the robot was seeing, because the image is like robot's eye view of the world. And so they could see what the robot was seeing, and that helped them better understand the robot and better understand how the robot would succeed in their home. So like one example was a robot cleaning under the couch, and it turned out that there was a ball of yarn under the couch that had been lost like months and months ago. And that's something that a robot would get stuck on typically. And so just knowing that that was there and being able to make a decision, like tell the robot to avoid it, but also go pick it up and rescue the yarn. Like that user was so excited that like the robot was sharing this information with them, and they were learning about the robot and getting that sort of that emotional connection with the robot and building that empathy. And that wasn't something that I had been thinking about when we were talking about algorithms and machine learning and all of these like really cool tech topics. I had sort of lost that piece. So that was a really fun one for me.
And it's really useful for like finding things that you lost under the sofa. So it's really exciting to see that, right? Like, I mean, I lose things all the time, and having that information shared with the user kind of helps in a lot of ways than we think.
Yeah, I know the big one that was really splashy in all the press was that it'll avoid pet waste or pet accidents, which obviously has a lot of value too. But I think those like really small human moments of like, I lost my headphones and the robot didn't eat them, like that's really what's nice for me.
Yeah, that's really cool actually. I never thought about that. Thank you for sharing with us.
No problem. Good question.
So
as a developer, it's always great to know like how interesting to learn how people interact and like bond with robots in general, like how they perceive them. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say to you and to anyone else who's a developer, like one thing that's really important to us at iRobot is having research be public, be something that anybody can come and participate in. And so we make an effort to include the whole team. So all the developers that are working on the robot, the product managers, the designers, everybody is able to come participate in that work. And if you are working somewhere or interning somewhere and you haven't found your UX designers or UX team or UX researchers, please go find them. Usually people are really excited if you're interested. And so even if you haven't been invited to participate in research, they may be willing to have you come along. I would hope they'd be willing to have you come along. It's always better to hear it directly from people than to hear it from me as the researcher, like spitting out the data after the fact.
Yeah, and it's super helpful in building empathy for the user, but also understanding why you're building a thing a certain way. Because as us designers will have recommendations, but to be out there as a developer, seeing what people are saying and learning, and you're like, oh, that's what they actually want. I was thinking something completely else. So that when it clicks, it's pretty fun to have developers in there and other people in there just listening.
Yes, and the empathy goes like both ways, because people have this tendency of getting frustrated over technology a lot. So having them understand what the robot is working like or what it is thinking basically would help, because I mean, I've seen a lot of people getting frustrated on their Roombas, which is not really nice.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think is more powerful than we give it credit for, building that empathy.
Well, we have another question.
Yeah,
I
can read through.
Go ahead.
Okay, no worries. Are there specific skills that one might need when they're applying to be a design or a researcher? Can you just kick us off with the researcher one?
Sure, great question. Yes, I think there's a few skills that are not like things you necessarily put on a resume, but relationship building is a huge part of what we do. Researchers are few and far between at most companies. iRobot actually has a pretty large research team, which is awesome. And we're an internal resource essentially, right? So we are supporting other teams. We're supporting programs that are building robots. We're supporting digital teams that are building new features. And so understanding what is helpful, what people want to learn, getting them involved in that process, and then giving them feedback that we're hearing from users and having that be internalized and actually be enacted and making change really comes down to the relationships that you have with those people on the team. If they'll come to you with questions, if they'll come to you when they want to know what a user said about something. So being able to build relationships, kind of be able to work in that environment is huge for succeeding in this kind of a role. So that's the big one, I would say. And then the other thing is just being creative in your approach, especially when we talk about research for robots. A lot of the times, as we've talked about tonight in our presentation, you don't have a thing to go test. And it's not, sometimes you can mock something up. We use tools like Figma and Sketch to be able to do mock-ups of mobile screens. But a lot of what we're working on, there's way more to the experience than just what you're seeing in the app on the phone. And so figuring out, coming up with ways to either mimic what that experience would be like or get at it from a different angle. Sometimes there's stuff people have tried before that you can find published online, but like a lot of times you're kind of inventing it as you go. And so being able to be flexible, be creative, that's also really critical. And then beyond that, I would say, like, if you're interested in research, there's some really great Medium articles. The UX Research Collective publishes stuff. So there's places that you can go learn about, like, what are the specific methodologies that are common? What is a think aloud protocol? What is a card sort? So for stuff like that, there's definitely plenty of resources, but that creativity, flexibility, and like relationship building is really what helps you succeed.
Yeah. And another one I would add to that is being comfortable with collaboration, because in the design team, we work with every part of the company: marketing, software, hardware engineers, digital software developers, anyone, test, data science, anyone that you can think of. So you really have to be comfortable with collaboration and communication, because a lot of our work is actually sharing. And I don't want to use convincing, but actually bringing other stakeholders on board with what the vision is and what the research was, and communicating. At least Lauren, like, she's in presentations every day, she's presenting data, she's talking to people and then presenting it again. So communicating what you've learned is really key, because if you're not able to get that across to the person that you're trying to, you kind of lose at bringing that stakeholders buy-in. So communication, collaboration, and design fundamentals, I would say. A lot of the design process, the different types of tools that we use. So there's ones for digital design, some for physical design. So all of that, I think, would be pretty critical. Also fun, if you're fun to work with. We really look for people when we're talking to them of how we would get along with them, because if you're working with someone every single day, every week, you want to really make sure they fit into the team culture. So yeah, that'd be another one.
For us, at least, a big part of that is being open to feedback. Like, can you take feedback? Are you open to receiving feedback? How does that go? We actually have a weekly meeting where everyone does design critique, and it's a really collaborative experience, but it's also a lot of feedback coming at you all at once. And so being able to kind of exist in that environment and be open to it and receive it positively is really important. Our team also likes puzzles. I don't like puzzles, but like the team does puzzles.
We have an entire table dedicated to it and a locker / area full of them. And it's really fun. Receiving feedback, but also giving feedback, I would say, because I think that's a skill. Because you don't want to just say something really bad or lead to the solution, but you want to encourage the thought process and give them feedback that's helpful to them.
Great point.
That's a really great way of communicating. I mean, not just a robot gets to give the feedback, right?
Yep.
So we are nearing the end of our session, and this was so wonderful. I mean, I love the enthusiasm you both talk with. This is like really great, and thank you for explaining us like so clearly and point to point everything. It really helped, and also love your presentation. And once again, thank you for coming in and explaining everything to us. And I think our attendees would like the same. So if I think for all the attendees, if you have any more questions, their email addresses are on the screen right now. And once again, thank you to our Zoom sponsors, Robotics, and Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and ending us on a successful note.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
having us.
having.
This was really
Really
fun.
enjoyed putting this together.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon.